Axl Rose was never known as a man who looked back. For decades, he survived by moving forward through chaos, anger, and noise, leaving wreckage behind him without apology. But there was one moment he could never outrun. Not a riot, not a lawsuit, not a failed album. It was a single decision he didn't make, a phone call he never placed, and a friend who never got the help he needed. Long after the stadiums fell silent, that absence stayed with Axl Rose. The regret that never made headlines. By the mid-1980s, Axl Rose was already living at a speed most people wouldn't survive. Guns N' Roses were rising fast, pulled forward by raw ambition and relentless pressure. Every night brought excess, exhaustion, and the constant sense that tomorrow could always wait. It was in this environment that Axl formed deep but fragile bonds, friendships built inside chaos, where concern was real, but time always felt borrowed. One of those friendships was with Todd Crew, the bassist for the New York hard rock band Jet Boy. Todd wasn't just another face in the scene. He was someone Axl cared about deeply, someone he worried about. In 1987, Todd was touring alongside Guns N' Roses, working as a roadie for Slash. He was young, reckless, and surrounded by the same temptations that followed every rising band: alcohol, drugs, and the illusion that nothing had consequences yet. Axl later admitted that he sensed something was wrong. He felt an urgent need to talk to Todd, to check in, to say something that might ground him. But urgency collided with distraction. Tours continued. Nights blurred together, and Axl convinced himself there would be time later. In an interview years later, he didn't soften the truth or hide behind excuses. He said he believed he had more time than he did. Todd Crew died in New York after an extended binge of drinking and heroin use. He was only 21. The night ended at the Milford Plaza Hotel after hours of partying that spiraled beyond control. The exact sequence of events has been disputed for decades, with conflicting accounts from those who were present. What remains undisputed is the outcome. Todd didn't make it out alive. When Axl learned what had happened, the weight didn't arrive as public grief or spectacle. It came as something quieter and far more destructive. This wasn't a scandal he could fight, or a critic he could attack. It was the realization that doing nothing had consequences too. He hadn't caused Todd's death, but he believed he might have intervened, and that belief stayed lodged in his conscience. Unlike the riots and controversies that followed him publicly, this regret lived in private. It wasn't shouted from stages or argued in courtrooms. It sat in the background of everything that came next, shaping how Axl viewed time, responsibility, and the cost of delay. In a life filled with explosive moments, this was the one that never made noise and never went away. The night that never stopped echoing. The night Todd Crew died did not end when the sun came up. It followed everyone who had been there, but it settled differently on Axl Rose. By the time the news reached him, the facts were already fractured, splintered into competing versions of what had happened inside the Milford Plaza Hotel in New York. What remained consistent was the sense that the night had crossed a line long before anyone realized it. Todd had been partying for nearly 18 hours. Alcohol, heroin, and exhaustion blurred judgment and slowed reactions. At that time, he was working closely with Slash, moving through the same cities, the same after-hours spaces, the same cycle of excess that defined life around Guns N' Roses. According to Slash's later account, he returned to New York after time abroad and spent the night scoring drugs. When Todd overdosed, Slash claimed he called emergency services, threw water on him, and desperately tried to revive him. He said Todd stopped breathing and died in his arms. But that version of events was not universally accepted. Members of Jet Boy later disputed Slash's account, stating that Todd had overdosed twice that night. They alleged that the first overdose was ignored, that no call for help was made, and that panic, drugs, and fear caused people to scatter instead of intervene. These conflicting narratives hardened into resentment and accusation, creating a fog where responsibility could no longer be clearly assigned. Axl Rose was not present in the room, but absence did not protect him from consequence. He absorbed the event not as a matter of blame, but as a question that would never resolve. What if he had acted sooner? What if he had trusted the instinct he already had, the feeling that Todd needed help? He had recognized the danger. He had felt concern. And yet he had waited. This was not the kind of regret that fades with time. Unlike professional disputes or public scandals, there was no resolution, no settlement, no apology that could close the wound. Todd was gone, 21 years old, and Axl was left confronting a reality he would later articulate with devastating clarity. Believing there would be time later was a mistake he could not undo. What made the regret sharper was the context of Axl's own life. He was already carrying the weight of trauma, instability, and survival instincts shaped by a violent upbringing and relentless pressure. Todd's death reinforced a pattern Axl would recognize too late, that chaos doesn't announce its final moment. It simply takes it. When regret turned inward. Todd Crew's death did not exist in isolation. It became the first crack in a structure that was already under unbearable pressure. For Axl Rose, the loss marked the beginning of a pattern where grief stopped arriving alone. It came in clusters, overlapping with exhaustion, fear, and a growing sense that everything around him was accelerating beyond his control. In the years surrounding Todd's death, Axl was already struggling with the psychological toll of sudden fame. He had never been comfortable with attention, never trusted crowds, and never fully believed in stability. The more successful Guns N' Roses became, the more isolated he felt. His instinct was not celebration, but defense, withdrawing, building walls, surrounding himself with security, and living in a constant state of alertness. That internal tension eventually turned destructive. In the late 1980s, Axl admitted that the pressure became too much. He spoke openly about a period when stress pushed him toward self-destruction, culminating in a near-fatal overdose. Unlike the excess that surrounded him, this was not recreational. It was a breaking point. He later said that he couldn't take the pressure anymore and felt himself unraveling. Hospitalized and aware of how close he had come to dying, Axl understood something chilling. He could easily become the next name added to the list. Todd's death hovered over that realization. It transformed the overdose from a warning into a mirror. Axl recognized how easily concern could be postponed, how quickly someone could slip from not okay to gone. The guilt he carried wasn't only about Todd anymore. It expanded into fear about himself, about friends, about everyone trapped in the same destructive cycle. As the years moved forward, the losses continued. Shannon Hoon, someone Axl knew from long before fame and shared roots with, died after spiraling through addiction. Around the same time, Axl learned that his mother was seriously ill. Her death followed soon after, adding a layer of unresolved emotion that left him unanchored. He had loved her deeply, but their relationship was complicated by her failure to protect him from abuse during his childhood. There was no clean closure, only unfinished conversations and unanswered questions. Control, collapse, and the fear of another too late. By the early 1990s, Guns N' Roses were no longer just a band, they were an empire under strain. Success had magnified every unresolved fracture, and at the center of it all was Axl Rose, tightening his grip not out of ego alone, but out of fear. Fear of mistakes, fear of chaos, fear that letting go would once again mean losing something he could never get back. The tension between Axl and Slash became the clearest expression of that struggle. What looked from the outside like artistic disagreement was, underneath, a clash between control and momentum. Slash wanted to keep moving, recording, touring, trusting instinct. Axl wanted to slow everything down, to examine every detail, to prevent irreversible damage. After years of loss and regret, forward motion without certainty felt dangerous to him. As the band fractured, members left one by one. The departures were public and painful, but Axl internalized them as another form of abandonment. Another confirmation that things fell apart when he couldn't hold them together tightly enough. Critics began to describe Guns N' Roses as no longer a band, but a vessel carrying Axl's unresolved battles. That perception stung deeply, even if he never said it outright. At the same time, his behavior became more erratic. Late starts, canceled shows, and confrontations with fans and authorities followed a familiar pattern. These weren't acts of indifference. They were symptoms of paralysis. Every decision felt weighted with consequence. If he went on stage too soon, something could go wrong. If he pushed forward before things felt right, damage might be permanent. And so delays multiplied, each one reinforcing his reputation as unreliable. Publicly, Axl absorbed criticism with defiance. Privately, the guilt grew heavier. He later acknowledged regret over how those moments reflected on the band, admitting that situations often spiraled out of control before he could stop them. But the admission came long after the damage was done. This was the cruel paradox of Axl Rose's regret. It didn't soften him. It hardened him. Instead of making him more flexible, it made him rigid. Instead of pushing him to act faster, it made him hesitate longer. Todd Crew's death had taught him that hesitation could be fatal, but it had also convinced him that acting without certainty was just as dangerous. By the mid-1990s, Guns N' Roses were effectively frozen in place, suspended between what they had been and what they could no longer become. And Axl, standing alone at the center, carried a familiar thought with him through every delay and confrontation, the fear that one wrong move would create another regret he could never undo. When regret became delay. By the mid-1990s, Axl Rose was no longer running from regret. He was building his life around it. What followed was not chaos in the traditional rock and roll sense, but something quieter and far more exhausting. Endless caution. Nowhere was this more visible than in the long, painful creation of Chinese democracy. The album began as a promise of reinvention, but slowly transformed into a psychological burden. Axl had already watched friendships dissolve, bands collapse, and lives end before their time. He had learned, painfully, that once something was released into the world, it could not be taken back. That belief shaped every decision he made in the studio. Years passed. Musicians rotated in and out. Producers came and went. Songs were rewritten, discarded, rebuilt. The process stretched far beyond what anyone expected, costing millions and testing the patience of fans who had once followed him with blind loyalty. To outsiders, it looked like obsession or arrogance, but underneath it was fear. Fear of repeating the mistake he believed he had made with Todd Crew by waiting too long, and fear of making a different mistake by moving too fast. Axl later admitted that he lived in constant anxiety that the album would be forced out before it was ready. The idea of releasing something unfinished terrified him. In his mind, unfinished work meant irreversible regret. When tracks leaked before release, the blow was devastating. He described it as a nightmare, not just because of the betrayal, but because it represented loss of control over something he had guarded for years. When Chinese democracy finally emerged, the response was fractured. Some praised its ambition and depth, others dismissed it as bloated and disconnected from the band's past. For Axl, the reception almost didn't matter. The damage had already been done. The album had consumed years of his life, isolating him further and reinforcing the narrative that Guns N' Roses had become something frozen in time. The regret that never left. When Axl Rose finally reunited with Slash after decades of silence and hostility, many fans framed it as redemption, a happy ending, proof that time heals everything. But for Axl, reconciliation did not erase the past. It simply allowed him to coexist with it more honestly. By the time Guns N' Roses returned to the stage together, Axl was no longer the man who reacted with explosions. He spoke less. He explained more. He even apologized publicly for years of lateness and cancellations, acknowledging that his behavior had hurt fans who only wanted to support him. Those admissions mattered, but they were not the core of his remorse. The deepest regret was never about concerts, albums, or public perception. It was about timing, the quiet realization that some moments demand action, and once missed, they never return. Todd Cruz's death remained the clearest example of that truth. Axl had sensed danger. He had felt concern, and yet he waited. Unlike many rock tragedies, this one did not become a song, a headline, or a mythologized story. It became something more personal and far more permanent. A lesson that shaped how Axl approached everything afterward: relationships, creativity, control, and fear. He became a man haunted not by what he did, but by what he didn't do. That distinction mattered. It explains why he clung to control, why he delayed decisions, why he struggled to trust momentum. In his mind, hesitation had once cost a life. Acting too late was not an abstract concept. It was a lived reality. Even as his career stabilized and his public image softened, that regret never transformed into closure. There was no resolution waiting at the end of it, no final apology that could be delivered, no forgiveness that could be received. Todd Cruz remained 21 forever, frozen in a moment Axl replayed in silence. Do you believe regret changes who we become? Or just teaches us how to live with what can't be undone? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold chapters behind music's most complicated legends.